The day Cora Keller arrived in Dusthaven, New Mexico territory. The year was 1882, and the sun was sitting so low and mean on the horizon that it turned everything the color of old blood. She stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a worn leather satchel, a second-hand trunk that had seen better decades, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to a woman who has already survived the worst the world had to offer. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, with gray eyes the color of a sky that had not yet decided whether it wanted to rain. She was not beautiful in the way that men in saloons talked about beautiful. She was something quieter than that, something that crept up on a person slowly, like the realization that a fire has been burning in a room the whole time, and you only just notice the warmth. Dusthaven was a cattle town, the kind that existed in that particular decade of the American West like a rough jewel pressed into the red earth. It had a main street of packed dust and timberfront buildings, a general store run by a man named Hewitt, a saloon called the Prairie Rose that smelled of sawdust and whiskey, a smithy, a church that was only half finished because the congregation kept arguing about the steeple, and a land office where men came to argue about boundaries and water rights. There was a sheriff, a man named Dellard, who was thickly built and honest enough by the standards of that era, which meant he was not for sale to just anyone. Cora had come to Dusthaven because she had answered an advertisement in a Kansas City newspaper seeking a schoolteacher for the growing settlement. She had taught school for 2 years in St. Louis before her mother died and her stepfather had drunk away the house and the savings and the dignity of everything that remained. She had packed what was hers, what little that was, and she had headed west because west was where a woman with nothing but her own 2 hands and a mind full of books could still carve something out. She had not come looking for a man. She had come looking for ground to stand on. The schoolhouse was small and smelled of raw pine and the faint ghost of old smoke. It had 12 desks, a blackboard that tilted slightly to the left, and a wood stove that would prove inadequate in January. The town council had arranged a room for her above the milliner's shop, run by a woman named Agnes Pratt, who was 50, sharp-tongued, and secretly the most generous person in the territory, and who pressed a warm meal and a cup of coffee into Cora's hands within 10 minutes of her arrival and asked her nothing about her past, which Cora considered the finest possible welcome she had ever received. She met Alfred Wallace on her 3rd day in Dusthaven. She had not planned to meet anyone. She was at Hewitt's general store, placing her first order of school supplies on the town's account, which the council had allocated, when a man came through the door with a particular kind of economy of movement that suggested a person who did not waste himself. He was 30 years old, lean and sun-darkened in the way of a man who lived outdoors by choice rather than hardship, though hardship had clearly been in the equation too. He had brown hair that was a little too long at the collar, a jaw that had met some difficulty at some point and healed slightly off-center, and eyes the color of dark amber, almost the exact shade of the good whiskey that Hewitt kept behind the counter for his better customers. He set a worn leather glove on the counter and asked Hewitt in a low, even voice whether a shipment of wire had come in. Hewitt said it had not. The man said he would be back Thursday and picked up his glove and turned to leave. He nearly walked directly into Cora, who was standing there with a list of pencils and slate boards and a McGuffey reader, and he stopped with a reflex quickness that spoke of a man who paid attention to his surroundings, and he said, without particular expression, "Pardon me, ma'am." "No harm," Cora said, stepping aside. He looked at her for just a moment longer than a casual glance required, the way a person looks at something that does not quite fit their existing understanding of a place, and then he was out the door. Hewitt, who missed nothing, said, "That is Alfred Wallace. He runs the Wallace spread about 8 miles northeast of town. Cattle mostly, some horses. Came out here 5 years ago from Texas. Keeps to himself." "I see," Cora said, returning to her list. "Good man," Hewitt added as if she had asked. She had not. Over the next 2 weeks, Cora Keller poured herself into the work of setting up her schoolhouse. She had 11 students ranging from age 6 to 15, an assortment of ranchers' children and the offspring of the few tradespeople in town. There was a girl named Molly Dellard, the sheriff's daughter, who was 12 and read like a house on fire. There was a boy named Jonas Pratt, Agnes's grandson, who was 8 and could not yet read but could calculate numbers in his head faster than most adults. There was a pair of Navajo children, a brother and sister named Thomas and Lily, who had been brought to town by their father, who worked as a tracker for the army post 20 miles east, and who sat in the back and spoke careful, formal English, and were not yet trusted by some of the other families, which Cora made it her business to address directly on the second day by seating them at the front and treating their answers with the same consideration she gave every other student, and by fixing a long look on any parent who came in to complain about the arrangement, a look so composed and absolute that the complaints generally died somewhere between the mouth and the air. She was not a woman who made noise about justice. She simply arranged things fairly and stood by the arrangement, and people found, to their surprise, that she was harder to move than she appeared. It was in the 3rd week of September, 1882, that the situation with the water rights arose, and it was this situation that began the real story. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Wallace spread had been drying up through that summer, not because of drought, though the summer had been dry, but because a man named Harlan Cross, who had bought up 4 sections of land 2 years prior, and was in the process of attempting to consolidate the whole northern range into one cattle empire, had dammed the upper tributary on his property in a way that reduced the water flowing downstream to a trickle. It was not entirely illegal under the territorial law of the time, which was imprecise and still being tested, but it was the kind of thing that sat in a man's chest like a coal, and it had effects that spread outward like a bruise. 3 small ranches to the east of Cross's holdings were feeling it, and Alfred Wallace's spread was one of them. Cora learned all of this not because anyone told her, but because she listened, and Dusthaven was a town that talked. She heard it at the general store, and she heard it at the well, and she heard it in fragments at the church social that Agnes Pratt dragged her to on the last Sunday of September. She sat in the shade of the half-finished church with a plate of food she was grateful for, and listened to the way people talked about Cross with a careful kind of fear, and the way they talked about Wallace with something closer to respect, and the way the whole thing seemed to be moving towards some kind of confrontation that nobody wanted and nobody knew how to avoid. She did not involve herself. It was not her business, and she had not come to Dusthaven to involve herself in land disputes. But she did begin to pay attention to Alfred Wallace in the way you pay attention to a thing that keeps appearing at the edges of your vision, not because you sought it out, but because it is simply there. He came into town every week, on Thursdays when the supply wagons ran. He was always polite, always quiet, always alone. She heard him speaking once to a group of 3 other ranchers outside the land office, and she noticed that he listened more than he spoke, and that when he did speak the others leaned in slightly, which was a particular kind of authority that had nothing to do with volume. She noticed that he tipped his hat to Agnes Pratt every time he passed her, and that he gave a coin to the Navajo boy Thomas one afternoon when the boy dropped a bundle of kindling outside the general store, not making a show of it, just pressing it into the boy's hand as he helped gather the wood, matter-of-factly, the way a person does a thing because it is the right thing and not because anyone is watching. She noticed these things, and she filed them away, and she told herself they were nothing. One afternoon in early October, a Thursday, she was carrying a heavy crate of books from the stagecoach office to the schoolhouse, a distance of about 2 blocks, and the crate was awkward and she was managing it but only barely, walking slowly with her chin tucked down to watch her footing on the uneven boardwalk. She heard boots behind her, and then Alfred Wallace was there, not precisely beside her, just in her line of sight, and he paused. She waited for him to offer to carry the crate, the way most men in town did, usually in a way that suggested they doubted her ability to manage it herself. He looked at the crate and then at her and he said, "You have it, or would another set of hands help?" It was such a specific and careful phrasing that she stopped walking. She considered the crate. It was heavy. Her arms were tired. "Another set of hands would help," she said. He took one side of the crate, she kept the other, and they walked the rest of the way to the schoolhouse together, neither of them saying anything in particular, and when they set the crate down inside the door he said, "Good afternoon," and left, and that was all. But she thought about the way he had asked it for the rest of the day. "You have it, or would another set of hands help?" Not assuming she could not manage. Not performing helpfulness. Just asking. She thought about it more than she wanted to. 2 weeks later she was at the Prairie Rose, which she had walked into once to establish that she was not a woman who let a saloon intimidate her, and which she went to occasionally in the early evenings when it was still respectable, to have a cup of coffee that was better than what Agnes made, because the Prairie Rose had a Mexican cook named Carmen who made the finest coffee in the territory. She was sitting at a corner table with a stack of student compositions when Alfred Wallace came in with 2 of his ranch hands and settled at the bar, and she was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a fireplace, peripherally, and with a certain amount of warmth that you do not precisely intend. After a while the 2 ranch hands went back out and he remained, nursing a whiskey and saying nothing to anyone, staring at the middle distance the way a man stares when he is working something out in his head. The saloon was half full and noisy with the particular noise of a cattle town on a Thursday evening, and eventually Carmen came through from the back and stopped to refill Cora's coffee, and then glanced toward the bar and called out, "Mr. Wallace, you look like you are trying to solve a problem with your eyes." He came back from wherever he had been. "Not solving it," he said. "Miss Keller here is the only smart person in this town," Carmen said, with the frank confidence of a woman who had strong opinions and saw no reason to keep them private. "She might have an idea." Cora looked up from her papers and met Alfred Wallace's eyes across the room, and something that was neither comfortable nor entirely uncomfortable passed between them. "I wouldn't want to trouble the lady," he said, which was not dismissive. It was almost careful, the way he said it. "I'm not troubled," Cora said. "I'm just grading compositions." He looked at her for a moment, then picked up his glass and walked across the room and stopped at the edge of her table, not sitting, not yet, just standing there with a kind of self-contained uncertainty that she found unexpectedly human. "May I sit?" he asked. "You may." He sat and he looked at the table for a moment and then he said, "You've been here long enough to have heard about the Cross situation." "I have," she said. "I'm trying to figure out whether to take it to the territorial court or try to negotiate directly with Cross, and I'm not getting any useful thinking done tonight," he said, with the directness of a person who does not waste time on pretense. "What does the territorial land law say about upstream water diversion?" she asked. He looked at her. "You know land law." "I know how to read," she said, "and I've been listening to this town talk about it for a month. I went to Hewitt's and found the 1876 territorial statutes in the reference section." There was a pause. "And what do they say?" "They say that a landowner may divert water on his own property so long as it does not materially deprive downstream users of their established use. The question is what constitutes material deprivation and what counts as established use. Both of those will need documentation." He was very still for a moment. "You found that in Hewitt's?" "It's a surprisingly good reference section," she said. He almost smiled. It was a careful, preliminary thing, the kind of smile that has been stored away for a long time and is not entirely sure it is safe to come out. "What kind of documentation?" he asked. "Water levels, recorded dates of use, witnesses. How long has your family used that creek?" 5 years. Before me, there was another rancher named Patterson who used it for 15 years prior." 20 years of established use would be significant," she said. You would need statements from anyone who can attest to Patterson's use and to yours. You would need to show the reduction in flow and connect it to the dam. It would be slow and it would be expensive, but it would be stronger than confronting Cross directly, which, based on what I hear about him, would go badly for everyone. He looked at her with those amber eyes for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only a few seconds. Why are you telling me this? It was an honest question, not suspicious, just genuinely curious. Because you asked, she said, and returned to her composition papers. He sat there for another moment, and then he said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Keller." She nodded without looking up, and he left, and she stared at the composition in front of her without reading a word of it for a full 5 minutes. November came, dry and cold, and the wood stove in the schoolhouse proved exactly as inadequate as she had anticipated. She requisitioned additional firewood through the town council, which was a process that required writing 2 letters and appearing at a council meeting in person, which she did with composed patience, and a detailed breakdown of the heating requirements per student that she had calculated on a sheet of paper, and which the council approved because it was impossible to argue with the mathematics. She had the wood delivered, and she stacked it herself, because the boy who was supposed to stack it did not show up, and she was not a woman who waited for things to be done when she could do them herself. It was while she was stacking the wood that Alfred Wallace rode past on his way out of town and stopped his horse and said, "Miss Keller." She looked up from the wood. "I filed the documentation with the territorial office in Santa Fe last week," he said. "I had 5 witnesses and 2 years of water measurements I'd kept for my own records. The clerk there said it was the most thorough water rights complaint he'd seen." "Good," she said. "I wanted you to know it was done," he said. "I appreciate that," she said. There was a pause in which the cold air moved between them, and above the open range the sky was the particular clear blue of a November afternoon in New Mexico, the kind of blue that had no mercy in it but was beautiful all the same. "Would you like some help with that?" he asked, gesturing at the wood. "Yes," she said, without hesitation this time. He tied his horse to the post and came over, and they stacked the wood together, efficiently, without ceremony, and when it was done he said, "There's a letter going to Mrs. Keller at the schoolhouse from the town council about the roof repair. It was in the mail pouch when I rode through." She looked at him. "How did you know it was for me?" "There's only one Mrs. Keller in Dusthaven," he said, and then paused, and something shifted slightly in his expression. "Miss Keller, I apologize." "It's all right," she said. "You're not married," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I am not," she said. Another pause. "I didn't assume," he said carefully. "I just noticed there was no—" He stopped himself. "No one looking out for me," she offered, not unkindly. He looked at her directly. "I was going to say no one accompanying you. But yes, I suppose that too." "I don't require anyone to look out for me," she said, "but I appreciate the stacking." He almost smiled again, that same careful, stored-up thing. He untied his horse and tipped his hat and rode out, and Cora stood in the cold November air looking at the stacked wood and feeling something in her chest that she did not have an immediate name for. She had heard things about Alfred Wallace from Agnes Pratt, who knew everything about everyone in Dusthaven and generally shared it in a spirit of information rather than gossip, which was how Agnes distinguished it in her own mind. She knew that he had come from a ranching family in the Texas Hill Country, that he had a younger brother back in Texas who he sent money to every month, that he had been briefly engaged to a woman in Abilene 7 years ago who had ended the engagement and married a banker, and that since arriving in Dusthaven, he had lived alone at his ranch with 2 hired hands named Pete Garrett and a Comanche man everyone called Sam, though that was not his name. And Alfred Wallace had at some point apparently learned enough Comanche to speak with him properly, which was unusual enough in 1882 to be worth noting. She also heard, through no particular effort, that he had once said to Hewitt, in a conversation about the subject of courtship and marriage, with the specific bluntness of a man 3 whiskeys into an honest evening, that he had been burned once, and what he wanted in a woman now was someone who wanted nothing from him and expected nothing. Because what he could not bear was the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on him every day like a hand on his chest. Hewitt had apparently said that such a woman did not exist. Wallace had apparently said, "Then I'll remain as I am and be content with that." Agnes had told Cora this story in November, over supper, in her gentle and observant way, watching Cora's face while she did, and Cora had listened without expression and said, "That sounds like a man who has been hurt and hasn't finished deciding whether to stay hurt." Agnes had smiled, the small private smile of a woman who has seen a great deal of life, and said nothing further. Cora turned the conversation over in her mind that night in her little room above the milliner's shop. She had lived through enough loss and enough disappointment to understand what it felt like to want to close yourself down, to want to exist in a space where no one could add to your particular accumulation of pain. She understood the appeal of a life stripped of expectation. She had, in her own way, been living that life herself. She had come to Dusthaven to stand on her own ground. She had not come expecting anything from anyone. It occurred to her, quietly and without drama, that perhaps that was exactly why she could understand a man like Alfred Wallace in a way that no one else in Dusthaven seemed to. December arrived with genuine cold, the kind that settled into the adobe and timber of Dusthaven and made the mornings sharp and crystalline, the sky an aching blue and the ground iron-hard with frost. Cora's school continued through the cold because she maintained the fire well, and the parents of her students had come to trust her enough to send them even on difficult mornings, which was a measure of how quickly she had established herself. She had, in the course of that autumn, become a person the town trusted, not because she had asked for trust or campaigned for it, but because she was consistent and competent and fair, and she did not ask anything of anyone that she was not prepared to do herself. When Jonas Pratt's family had a rough patch in November, and there was a question of whether Agnes could continue to keep him, Cora had quietly arranged with Hewitt to adjust his account so that the school supplies for Jonas were charged to her own small salary rather than the town. She had not mentioned it to Agnes. Agnes had found out anyway, through the impenetrable information network of a small town, and had come to Cora's room and held her hands and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent thing Agnes ever did. When the Navajo children, Thomas and Lily, stopped appearing in late November, Cora had ridden out to speak with their father, a quiet and dignified man named Hosteen who was camped with his family at the edge of the army post. She had spoken to him respectfully, had listened when he explained that his contract with the army post had ended, and he was uncertain of their position in Dusthaven, and she had gone back to town and spoken to Sheriff Dellard, and then to 2 members of the town council, and within a week, Hosteen had a new arrangement as a guide for the territorial surveyor, and Thomas and Lily were back in school. She had not made a speech about it. She had simply moved the pieces until they fit. Word of these things spread in the way that small-town words spread, through layers and iterations, and people came to a quiet understanding of what kind of woman Cora Keller was. A woman who did things. A woman who asked nothing. A woman who was simply, steadily, making herself indispensable to a place without ever seeming to try. Alfred Wallace heard all of it, as people in small towns hear things, in pieces and asides, and he thought about what he heard more than he expected to. He came to her with a second question in December, about a contract dispute with a cattle buyer in Socorro, which was a different kind of legal territory, but the principle was similar, and she read the contract he brought and identified the clause that was problematic in under 10 minutes, and told him what to ask for in negotiation, and he looked at her with that amber-eyed directness and said, "Did you study law?" "I studied everything I could get my hands on," she said. "In St. Louis there was a library." "You miss it," he said. It was not phrased as a question, but it was asking something. "I miss the books," she said. "I don't miss St. Louis." "What was in St. Louis?" She looked at him steadily. "Nothing I wanted to stay for." He accepted that. the way he seemed to accept most things she said without pressing or explaining it back to her, and she found this quality in him to be one of the most restful things about being in his company. They fell into a kind of irregular, unprogrammed pattern after that, which was perhaps the most honest kind of pattern. When he came to town on Thursdays, she was often at the Prairie Rose in the early evening, and he would sometimes sit at her table and they would talk, sometimes about his legal and practical concerns, sometimes about the town, sometimes about things that had nothing to do with either. He told her about his ranch, not boastfully but with the specific love of a person who has built something with their own hands and knows every imperfection in it. She told him about her students with the quiet intensity of a teacher who genuinely believed that the minds of children were the most important investment a society could make, which was not the most common view in 1882 New Mexico, but was hers entirely. He told her once about Sam, whose actual name was Tassawihi, which meant white knife, who had come to work on the Wallace spread 3 years ago after a difficult period following the final settlement of the Comanche onto the reservation in Texas, which had happened in the brutal campaigns of the mid-1870s. Alfred Wallace had met him in Texas, had learned some of the language out of respect and practicality, and had offered him honest wages and a position that was a job and not charity, and Tassawihi had come north with him to New Mexico. He said this without any particular performance of virtue, just as a fact of his life, and Cora listened and understood something new about the architecture of this man. She told him in return about her mother, and about the 2 years of teaching in St. Louis, and about the decision to come west, and he listened the same way she did completely without waiting for his turn to speak, which was rarer than it should have been. In December, a thing happened that changed the temperature of everything between them, though neither of them spoke about it directly for a while. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Cora was walking back from the church, where she had been helping Agnes organize the Christmas social, and the cold had come in fast off the mesa with the particular spite of a New Mexico December wind, cutting right through her coat, which was a good coat but had been bought for St. Louis winters and was not quite equal to this. She had another 3 blocks to walk to Agnes's shop, and she was walking fast with her head down when she heard a shout and then a crash, and she looked up in time to see that a loaded freight wagon had lost a wheel at the corner, and its load of timber was spilling across the road in a slow and terrible cascade. There was a child in the road. It was Jonas Pratt, who was carrying a pail and staring at the coming timber with the frozen expression of a small boy who has been surprised by danger. The wagon driver was yelling, the horse was screaming, and there was about 4 seconds before the timber reached Jonas. Cora ran. She got to Jonas in 2 seconds and pulled him hard to the side, tripping on the edge of the boardwalk and going down onto her knee, holding Jonas against her side, and the timber came down where he had been standing, crashing and splintering across the frozen road, one piece catching her shoulder before she got clear. She sat in the road in the cold with Jonas in her arms and the world very loud and then very quiet, and her shoulder was hurting in a way that was going to be impressive by evening, and Jonas was crying and unhurt, and she held him until he stopped. Alfred Wallace had been coming out of the land office across the street. He had seen the whole thing. He crossed to her in 4 long strides, crouching down in the road beside her, his hand coming to her arm with a restraint that she would think about later, not grabbing, not pulling, just settling there with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the urgency in his face. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "My shoulder," she said. "It will be sore." "I'm not badly hurt." He looked at her shoulder with an expression that was working hard to stay controlled and not entirely succeeding. "Can you stand?" "Yes." She stood, keeping hold of Jonas, who had stopped crying and was now looking at the scattered timber with the wide-eyed fascination of a child who has just been close to something terrible and found, to his surprise, that he was still whole. "Let me take him to Agnes," Alfred said. I know you can," he said, and the way he said it, low and even, stopped her. "I know you can, let me help." She looked at him, this man who had said once that he wanted a woman who asked nothing, and something in his face in that moment was asking something of her, asking her to let him be useful, asking her to let there be a thing he could do, and she understood that this was its own kind of asking. "All right," she said. He walked with them to Agnes's shop, Jonas's hand in his, and Agnes opened the door and took one look at the situation and had Jonas inside, and settled with a warm biscuit in under a minute. And then she looked at Cora's shoulder and said briskly that it was bruised and possibly something strained but nothing broken, and she would wrap it and it needed rest. Cora sat in Agnes's parlor and had her shoulder wrapped and drank the coffee that Agnes produced with military efficiency, and Alfred Wallace sat in the chair across from her and did not say anything for a while, which she was grateful for. "You could have been hit worse," he said finally. "I wasn't," she said. "No," he said. "You weren't." He looked at her across Agnes's parlor with the fire going and the cold outside and the small warm light of the oil lamps, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything about what they were both thinking, because neither of them was a person who spoke before they were certain, and they were not yet certain. But something had shifted. Something that had been standing at a careful distance had taken one step closer, and they both felt it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Christmas came to Dusthaven with the specific bittersweet quality of a frontier Christmas, which was joyful but aware of its own impermanence, the way all things were in a place that was still being made. The church social was held in the half-finished church, and Agnes Pratt had organized it with the thoroughness of a military campaign, and there was food and music, and the particular warmth of a community that lived close enough to difficulty to know how to appreciate its own moments of celebration. Alfred Wallace came, which surprised some people, because he was generally not a man for social gatherings. He arrived alone, in a clean shirt and his good coat, and he found Cora almost immediately, with the directness of a man who had decided something, and he brought her a cup of warm cider and sat beside her through most of the evening, and the town observed this with varying degrees of interest and satisfaction. And Agnes Pratt said nothing, but watched everything with the expression of a woman whose private hypothesis was proving itself out. They talked through the evening, easily, the way people talk when they have gotten past the part where they are performing themselves, and have arrived at the simpler thing beneath. He told her about Christmases in Texas when he was young, before the family's troubles, when the hill country was green, and his father was still the man he had believed his father to be. She told him about the best Christmas she could remember, which was a meager one when she was 12, but when her mother had been well and happy, and had read aloud to her by candlelight until late, and she had felt, for that one night, completely safe. He listened to that with the particular stillness of a man who understands what it means to have a specific memory of feeling safe, and what it means to not have had that feeling in a long time. "What made you come to New Mexico?" he asked her, not because he did not know the outline of it, but because he wanted to hear it from her. "I told you," she said, "West was where I could start." "Start what?" She considered this with honesty, because she was a person who tried to be honest with herself even when it was uncomfortable. "Start something that belonged entirely to me," she said. "Something I built with my own hands. Back east there was always someone trying to manage what I was or what I should want. I wanted to be somewhere that had room." He was quiet for a moment. "That is not so different from why I came." "No," she said. "I didn't think it was." A fiddle started up across the room. One of the ranch hands had a considerable talent, and the social shifted into music and dancing, and the half-finished church filled with the particular joy of people who worked hard and danced like they meant it. Alfred Wallace stood up and held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, and then she took it. He danced with a deliberate, economical grace, not showy but certain, and she matched him, and the fiddle ran through 3 reels and a waltz, and somewhere in the waltz they were close enough that she could smell the cold night air and pine soap on his coat, and his hand at her back was careful and warm. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her with its simplicity, that she was happy in this moment, which was not a feeling she had had in a long time, and she decided, quietly and for herself alone, that she was going to let it be real. January was hard, as January in New Mexico Territory generally was, and the ranch work and school work both demanded everything from the people who did them. And Cora and Alfred fell into the rhythm of two people who exist in parallel orbits that are slowly, deliberately drawing closer without making a fuss about it. He started bringing firewood to the schoolhouse on Thursdays, not asking, just arriving with a load in his wagon bed and stacking it by the door, and she let him without making a production of it, because she understood by now that this was Alfred Wallace's language, quiet usefulness, the language of a man who expressed himself in things done rather than things said. She started leaving a book on the Prairie Rose bar for him on Thursday evenings, a different one each week, with a page marked and a brief note in the margin, not demanding he read it, just leaving it there in case he wanted to. The first one was a volume on territorial water law, which made him laugh, the first full honest laugh she had heard from him, low and genuine, and he read the whole thing and brought it back with his own notes in the margins, written in a careful and very slightly crooked hand, and after that it became a thing they did, passing books back and forth with their margins filling up like a conversation in a second language. And she came to know his mind through those margins more completely than through any direct exchange. In early February, the territorial court issued a preliminary ruling in the water rights case. The documentation Cora had suggested, thorough and meticulously compiled as Alfred had made it, was found to support the claim of material deprivation. Harlan Cross was ordered to modify his dam within 60 days to restore adequate downstream flow, and the ruling was clear enough that his lawyers, when he produced them, had limited room to maneuver. Alfred came to tell her on a Thursday evening, and he was not a man who showed elation easily, but there was something alive in his face that she had not seen before, a brightness, a kind of unlocking. "It worked," he said simply. "Of course it did," she said. "The law was on your side. You just needed to document it properly." "Without you I'd have gone to Cross directly," he said. "That would have gone badly in more ways than one." "I know," she said. "You are not a man who backs down from things." He looked at her. "Is that a criticism?" "No," she said. "It's an observation." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the careful way he had of saying things that mattered, "I don't know what I would do without your counsel, Miss Keller." It was an admission of something. She felt it in the air between them, the way a shift in temperature feels before you can name what is happening. "You would manage," she said quietly. "I would," he said, "but less well." She met his eyes, and for a moment neither of them looked away. "Alfred," she said, using his given name for the first time. Something in his face changed, subtle and deep, like the surface of water when something moves underneath it. "Cora," he said. It was not a sentence. It was not an action. It was just her name, spoken by him, and it contained everything that neither of them had said yet, and she felt it settle into her chest and stay there, warm and certain. March came, and with it mud and the first green things showing at the base of the creek banks, and the Wallace spread had its water back, the creek running clear and steady again after Cross made his modifications, grumbling and maneuvering until his lawyers told him the alternatives were worse. The land east of Dusthaven smelled of new grass and damp earth, and the early wildflowers that came up in New Mexico like a promise kept, yellow and purple and white scattered across the red ground. On a Saturday in early March, Alfred rode out to where Cora was walking along the edge of the creek east of town, something she did on Saturday afternoons when school was not in session, and she wanted to think. She had told Agnes she went for walks, and Agnes had said, with characteristic precision, that she found it useful to walk east of town on Saturday afternoons around 3 o'clock, and had then gone back to her sewing with the serenity of someone who has said exactly as much as needs saying. He rode up and dismounted and fell into step beside her, leading his horse by the reins, and they walked along the creek without any particular destination for a while, and the afternoon was cold and clear and perfect in the way of early spring in the desert. "I want to tell you something," he said after a while. "All right," she said. He was quiet for another few steps. "I told Hugh at once, when I'd had more whiskey than was probably wise, that what I wanted was a woman who asked nothing of me. Because I'd had enough of," he paused, choosing the words the way he chose everything, with care. "Enough of feeling like what I was never quite sufficient. Like whatever I gave was either too much of the wrong thing or not enough of the right thing. I said I wanted to be left alone." "I heard," she said. He glanced at her. "Small town," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes." He looked back at the creek. "What I want to say is that you have never asked a single thing of me that I can recall. Every time I've offered, it's been mine to offer. Every time you've taken help, it's been because I gave it first and you received it honestly, not because you expected it or required it from me." She did not say anything, just walked and listened. "And what I have found," he said slowly, "is that in the absence of being asked for anything, I have wanted to give you everything." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and turned to look at her, and the afternoon light was on his face, and the creek was running clear and steady beside them, and the wildflowers were coming up in the red dirt, and she thought that she had spent her whole life managing and surviving, and asking nothing of anyone because asking was how you got hurt, and she had been right about that, until somehow the same strategy had led her here, to a man who saw that about her and called it beautiful, who had been looking for the same freedom she had been looking for and found it, unexpectedly, in her company. "I don't know how to be easy to love," she said. "I've been too independent for it, or so I've been told." "I'm not looking for easy," he said. "I've been easy to leave. I want something worth staying for." She looked at him for a long moment. This man with his careful hands and his amber eyes and his marginal notes in borrowed books. This man who stacked firewood and filed legal documentation and learned languages out of respect. This man who had been burned before and had decided that what he needed was freedom from expectation, and had found, without expecting it, a woman who offered exactly that, and who had fallen in that space of no expectations into something much larger than he had planned. "Alfred," she said. "Yes," he said, and it was an answer to several things at once. She took one step toward him, and he closed the distance, and he kissed her in the March afternoon beside the newly running creek, with the smell of new grass and the cold high blue of the sky above them, and it was not a tentative thing. It was the kiss of two people who have been circling something true for a long time and have finally arrived at its center, honest and unhurried and absolute. When they stepped apart, he looked at her with that amber gaze and said, very quietly, "I have been thinking about doing that since October." "Since October," she said. "That is a long time to think." "I am a thorough thinker," he said. She laughed, and he looked at her laugh with an expression that could only be described as reverence. And then he laughed too, and the sound of it went out across the open land, across the new grass and the running creek and the endless sky, and was both entirely private and somehow enormous. They walked back to town in the late afternoon with their hands close enough that the backs of his knuckles brushed hers at intervals, neither of them requiring more than that, both of them entirely certain of more. Agnes Pratt opened her front door as they came back down Main Street and looked at the two of them with the composed satisfaction of someone watching a prediction come true, and said nothing whatsoever, which was itself a kind of commentary, and went back inside. April brought the cattle season properly, and Alfred was consumed with the work of his ranch in the way that the Texas spring used to consume him, the particular intensity of a man whose livelihood is measured in weight and weather and water, all three of which required vigilance. He rode out before dawn and came back after dark 6 days out of 7, and the Wallace spread had, in these months, become a solid and growing operation. The water rights settlement had secured the creek for the eastern ranchers, and it had also, in the particular political economy of a cattle town, established Alfred Wallace as a man who knew how to fight intelligently, and that kind of reputation had its own value. Cora's school ran through April, as she had arranged with the town council, going somewhat longer than the original term because 2 of her students were behind where she wanted them to be, and she was not a person who left a thing unfinished because the calendar said she could. They found time when they found it, which was not always easy, and they did not make it difficult by demanding it. Sunday afternoons were sometimes possible, Thursday evenings at the Prairie Rose, an hour here or there when the work allowed. She found that she liked him most in the particular tiredness of the late evening, when the performance of the day had come off and he was simply himself, candid and quiet and real. He found that he liked her always, which surprised him continually, because he had not expected to find a person who felt restful to be around while also feeling vital, as though the air was better quality in her vicinity. In April he took her to see his ranch for the first time, riding out on a Sunday with a proper escort of Agnes Pratt's opinion, who said that if 2 adults of good reputation chose to ride to a man's property to look at cattle, that was their business and not hers, which was her way of approving the excursion. The Wallace spread was 8 miles northeast of town on a stretch of good land, with the creek running along its eastern edge, and a ridge of low red hills to the north that broke the worst of the winter wind. The ranch house was timber and adobe, solid and well built, not large but with a quality of care in its construction that told her exactly the same things about him she already knew. There was a barn that smelled of hay and horses and the comfortable life of working animals. Pete Garrett was a lean, weathered man of about 45 who tipped his hat and went back to mending fence. Tassawihi, White Knife, was younger, perhaps 35, with a quiet watchfulness and a composure that she recognized as akin to her own, and he looked at her with a direct appraisal that she met evenly, and then he said something in Comanche to Alfred, who replied in kind, and Tassawihi smiled briefly and went back to the horse he was working with. "What did he say?" she asked. Alfred looked forward for a moment. "He said you have the eyes of someone who sees what is real." She was quiet for a moment. "And what did you say?" "I said I knew." She looked at the land around her, the red earth and the new green of spring grass along the creek and the clarity of the sky, and she felt the particular quality of rightness that comes when a place matches the person you are with, when 2 things that belong together are finally occupying the same space. "It's beautiful land," she said. "It is," he said. "It's better today." She looked at him. He was looking at the creek with that private, careful expression, and she understood that he was not going to embroider it further, that he had said it plainly and meant it plainly. And that was how he loved things, plainly and without decoration, and it was exactly right. May arrived with warmth and blossoming and the kind of buoyant, reckless energy that comes off the desert in spring, and the town of Dusthaven buzzed with the specific electricity of a community that was growing, new families arriving, the land office busy, a second hotel going up beside the first one. There was talk of a proper telegraph line reaching them by the end of summer, and a school board was in discussion that would formalize and expand Cora's position, giving her a slightly larger classroom and a modest raise, which she negotiated with quiet competence at the council meeting. Harlan Cross made one more attempt to complicate the water situation, filing a counterclaim with the territorial office, arguing that the original ruling had been misapplied. And this time Cora helped Alfred draft his formal response, sitting at the table in the Prairie Rose on a Tuesday evening after close. Both of them bent over the papers with the oil lamp between them, their heads close. Her handwriting filling in the legal arguments and his knowledge of the facts of the land giving it its specificity and authority. Carmen kept them in coffee and left them to it with the discretion of a woman who understood what was happening at that table and approved. The counterclaim was dismissed in June. Cross did not try again after that. He sold 2 of his northern sections the following year and turned his attention south, where there was less resistance. On a Saturday evening in late May, Alfred Wallace came to Agnes Pratt's front door and knocked, and Agnes opened it and said, "She is in the garden," with no expression whatsoever, and went back inside. Cora was in the small garden behind the milliner's shop, which was her Saturday project. A kitchen garden she had persuaded Agnes to let her plant, and she was on her knees in the dirt with a trowel, and her hands were dirty and her hair was coming down. And she looked up when she heard his boots on the garden path, and she must have looked, she thought afterward, completely unimpressive, with dirt on her hands and her hair loose and her old work dress. He stood at the edge of the garden path and looked at her for a moment with that amber gaze that she had spent 6 months learning to read, and she read something in it now that was both certain and slightly unsteady, the way a very controlled person looks when they are about to do something that matters. "Cora," he said. "Alfred," she said, sitting back on her heels, the trowel in her hand. "I have been thinking," he said. "You told me you are a thorough thinker," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, with a patience that was almost amusement, "about a number of things, about the last 8 months. About what my life looked like before you arrived in this town and what it looks like now. About what I said to Hewitt 3 years ago about wanting a woman who expected nothing." She waited, the trowel steady in her hand, the evening light warm on the garden. "You have asked nothing of me," he said. "In 8 months you have taken what I offered freely and you have given back in kind and you have asked nothing. And I find that I want to give you everything. Everything I have and everything I can build. I want to give you this land and this life and whatever comes after it. I want to ask you to stay." The garden was quiet around them, the evening smell of the desert earth rising around her. And she looked at this man who had been looking for freedom and found it in her company, and who was now standing here in the dirt and the evening light asking her to stay. And she felt the whole long year of arriving and building and standing on her own ground, and discovering that standing on her own ground did not preclude standing on it with someone beside her. And she felt something in her chest open like a door that has been closed for a long time, opening on good air. "I would like that," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment that felt like all the months they had spent arriving at this one, and then he came down the garden path and helped her up, and he held her hands in his, dirt and all, and she looked up at him and he kissed her, and it was different from the first kiss in March. It was quieter and steadier, a kiss that knew what it was, a kiss that had already decided to stay. "I should have something formal to offer you," he said, against her hair. "You offered me everything you have," she said. "That is formal enough for me." He laughed, soft and real. They were married in August 1882 in the half-finished church, which the congregation had finally agreed on the steeple for, and which had a proper roof now, though the interior was still somewhat sparse. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, who came through Dusthaven on the 2nd Sunday of every month, a man named Father Callaghan, who was Irish and cheerful, and had strong opinions about the permanence of vows. Agnes Pratt sat in the front row and did not cry exactly, but her eyes were very bright. Tassoui came down from the ranch in his good clothes and sat with Pete Garrett at the back, and said nothing through the whole service, but afterward shook Alfred's hand with a gravity that spoke of genuine respect. Sheriff Dellard was there with his daughter Molly, who was wearing her best dress and watching the whole proceedings with the intense scholarly interest she brought to everything. Hosteen came with Thomas and Lily, who had become Cora's fiercest students in the past months, and sat quietly in a back pew, and Cora had looked for them specifically when she came in and met Hosteen's eyes across the church, and he had given a small grave nod, which she returned. When Father Callaghan asked her if she would take this man, she said, "I will," with the clarity of a woman who knows what she is doing, and when the preacher pronounced them married and Alfred kissed her, the small congregation of Dusthaven, New Mexico Territory, made a sound that was somewhere between applause and relief. And Agnes Pratt said, "Finally, with perfect composure, and several people around her agreed. The reception was held in the Prairie Rose, which Carmen had decorated with Mexican paper flowers in yellow and red, and there was food and whiskey and Carmen's excellent coffee, and the fiddle player played until midnight. And at some point during the evening Cora was standing at the edge of the room with a glass of wine that Hewitt had produced from somewhere impressive, watching the room, her town, her life. This life she had come west with nothing to build. And Alfred was beside her with his hand at the small of her back, easy and natural as though it had always been there. "Are you happy?" he asked low just for her. She considered the question with the honesty she brought to everything, looking around at Agnes and Molly and Carmen and Hostein's children and Pete Garrett attempting to dance and the whole warm lit room of it. And then she looked at him, this man she had not come looking for, this man who had not been looking for her, this man who had found the thing he needed by letting go of the thing he thought he needed, and she said, "Yes." "Good," he said. "Are you?" she asked. He looked at her with that amber gaze, and the smile came out fully this time, no longer careful, no longer stored away, just his smile, real and complete. "More than I knew was possible," he said. They moved to the ranch in September, after Cora arranged with the town council for the school to continue in the fall with a second teacher they had recruited from Albuquerque, a serious young woman named Margaret Holt, who had come with solid credentials, and whom Cora spent 2 full weeks showing the specifics of her students, her methods, and her particular insistence on treating Thomas and Lily and Jonas Pratt and every other child in that room as though they were equally capable of everything, which Margaret took to with an earnestness that satisfied Cora considerably. Cora did not stop teaching. She continued to ride into Dusthaven 3 days a week and teach, because she was not a person who abandoned a thing she had built, and because her students were not yet done with her, and she was not yet done with them. Alfred supported this without qualification, which she had expected, but which she appreciated specifically, because the absence of qualification was its own kind of statement. Life at the Wallace spread settled into the rhythms of a working ranch in the fall and winter of 1882. And Cora found that she was built for this life in ways she had not known before she arrived at it. She was practical and physical, and she did not mind the early mornings or the hard work or the absolute dependence on the land cycles that ranch life required. She learned cattle, she learned horses, she learned to read the sky the way the men did, for weather and wind and the particular color that presaged a storm. She and Tassawahi developed a mutual respect that deepened over months into something closer to friendship, conducted partly in silences and partly in the direct economical language of 2 people who said exactly what they meant and nothing more. Pete Garrett, for his part, expressed his adjustment to the presence of a woman at the ranch by becoming gradually and obviously protective of her, which manifested as careful cursing, very good fire building, and the occasional unexplained appearance of small practical gifts, a better water bucket, a fixed hinge on the kitchen door, a new shelf for her books, which arrived without comment and without expectation of comment, and which she appreciated in the exact spirit in which they were given. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard, cold down into the single digits in January, and the cattle had to be moved and the pipes wrapped and the horses watched. And there were nights when the wind came off the mesa, and the ranch house was tight and warm with the fire going, and the smell of the range winter outside. And she and Alfred sat at the table with books and papers, and the margins of their correspondence filling with the comfortable debris of a shared life. She found in him, over those months, dimensions that delighted her. The man who had seemed so solitary and self-contained was in fact full of things he had been waiting for an occasion to share. He had opinions about books that were strong and precise. He had a dry humor that emerged when he was comfortable, which he was now, in a way he had not been before. He had a love for the land that was almost spiritual, the kind of relationship with place that comes from someone who has worked it with their own hands and received it back as a living thing. And hearing him talk about the creek in spring or the particular way the light hit the ridge to the north was like hearing someone describe a person they loved. And she understood that the land was part of what he was, and she loved it too for that reason. In February of 1883, Cora told Alfred that she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast simply, because she was not a woman for dramatic revelations, and she watched his face in the morning light and saw something move across it that was too large and various to name, surprise and joy, and a particular kind of terror that belongs to a person who has not let themselves want something for a long time and is suddenly confronted with having it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her and took her face in his hands and looked at her, and there was nothing careful or stored away in his face now. It was all open, everything at once. "Cora," he said, and that was all. She covered his hands with hers. "I know," she said. The baby was born in October 1883 at the ranch with the help of the midwife from Dusthaven, a capable woman named Mrs. Pina, and Agnes Pratt, who had announced 3 months prior that she would be present, and no one had disagreed. It was a boy, and he came into the world on a clear October morning that smelled of sage and the first cool air of autumn. And Alfred held him, this small, impossible person, with the careful, specific tenderness of a man who does not do things halfway. They named him Thomas, for the Navajo boy who had been Cora's student and who had, in that first autumn, taught her something about the cost of belonging to a place that did not fully acknowledge your right to be there, and whose name she wanted to carry forward as a kind of quiet insistence on memory. Thomas Wallace was a dark-haired, loud, opinionated baby who grew into a dark-haired, loud, opinionated toddler who terrorized Pete Garrett's ankles and was beloved by Tassawihi, who taught him the Comanche name for horse before he was 2, which was Puku, and which was Thomas's first word, to Alfred's complete satisfaction and Agnes Pratt's delighted approval. The school in Dusthaven continued under Margaret Holt's able management, with Cora still involved 3 days a week, and in the spring of 1884 the new schoolhouse was finished, larger and better insulated, with a proper library that Cora had spent the winter curating through careful correspondence with a book supplier in Kansas City, soliciting donations from 3 different patrons, and writing one very persuasive letter to the Territorial Education Board that resulted in a formal grant of $60, which she had listed and allocated down to the last penny in a ledger she still had. Hostein's children, Thomas and Lily, graduated from her school and went on to the secondary school in Santa Fe that had begun to accept native students, the first of her students to make that journey, and Cora cried when they left, privately, in the kitchen garden that she had moved from Agnes's to the ranch and expanded considerably. Agnes Pratt came to the ranch for dinner every Sunday and considered herself Thomas's honorary grandmother, and no one disputed this, including Thomas, who called her Nan by the time he could speak in sentences, and sat in her lap at Sunday dinners with the absolute confidence of a child who knows he is loved without condition. In 1885, when Thomas was 2 years old, Cora began work on a project she had been thinking about since arriving in Dusthaven, a lending library for the town, a real one, a public collection that could serve the community the way the library in St. Louis had once served her. She proposed it to the town council in January, with a full plan for acquisition, funding, and maintenance, and argued its case with the thorough, calm logic of a woman who had been arguing cases before various skeptical authorities for her entire professional life. The council approved it, partly because the plan was airtight, and partly because Cora Keller was not a person who could be easily declined when she wanted something, and she had spent 3 years demonstrating to the town that the things she wanted were always things that served everyone. Alfred helped her convert the empty back room of the land office into the library space, spending 3 Saturdays in the summer of 1885 building the shelves himself, careful and precise, and filling them initially with their own books and the books she had solicited. And the finished thing was small but real, 27 shelf feet of books in a clean white room with a window that looked out at the main street. And she stood in it when it was done and looked at the shelves and felt, very specifically and deeply, that she had made something. He came in behind her and stood looking at it over her shoulder, his hands at her waist. "I am proud of you," he said. She leaned back against him. "I am proud of this," she said. "Are they the same thing?" he asked. She thought about it. "In a very nice way," she said. "Yes." By the fall of 1885, the Wallace spread had grown. They had purchased an additional 3 sections to the west, and Alfred had taken on 2 more hands. The cattle operation was solid and respected. They were selling to the Army contracts that were coming through Santa Fe, which were reliable and well-paying. And Alfred had also begun a horse breeding program with Tassawihi, who had specific knowledge of the horses his people had bred for centuries, and who was, in Alfred's estimation and Cora's, one of the finest horsemen on the territory. Tassawihi had also, in the spring of 1884, met a woman named Maria, who was the niece of Carmen from the Prairie Rose, and who had come to Dusthaven to help at the saloon kitchen, and had stayed because of the man who quietly learned her language and treated her with the same direct and careful respect he showed everyone he considered worthy of his regard, and she had decided he was worth staying for. They were married by Father Callaghan in the fall of 1884, and lived on the Wallace spread in a house that Alfred and Pete built together one September weekend, and their daughter was born in 1885, a small bright-eyed girl who was Thomas Wallace's first best friend and who Maria named Rosa, for the rose that bloomed in the desert against all odds. Dusthaven continued to grow through 1885 and into 1886. The telegraph line came through in the summer of 1885 as promised, and the second hotel opened, and there was talk of a proper rail connection in the next decade that would change everything. The way the rail always changed everything, sometimes for the better and sometimes not, but it was coming regardless, and the people of Dusthaven were making their peace with it. Harlan Cross eventually sold his entire holdings in 1886 and moved to Denver, where he apparently invested in mining interests and was not missed by anyone in the territory. The land he left behind was parceled and sold, and the water rights of the eastern ranchers remained protected, a precedent set by a carefully filed legal document that had begun with a conversation between a schoolteacher and a rancher in the Prairie Rose Saloon in the fall of 1882. Cora Keller Wallace, as she was now, turned 28 in 1886 and stood in the ranch house kitchen on an October morning making coffee while the sun came through the window that faced east, the window Alfred had specifically oriented when he extended the kitchen in the spring, because she had mentioned once in passing that she liked to see the sun come up, and he had said nothing and filed it away, and 3 months later the window was there, facing east, letting in the morning. Thomas was 3 and asleep still, the sleep of a small person who runs at full capacity until he drops, and the ranch was quiet in the early hour, and she could hear Alfred in the barn, the familiar sounds of the morning work beginning, and outside the sky was the deep blue that preceded sunrise, and the sage was silver with dew, and the creek was running. She poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them out to the barn, and she found him there with the horse he was training, a young roan gelding with a clever eye, and he looked up when she came in and reached for the coffee with the easy naturalness of a man who has received kindness from the same person every morning for 3 years and never takes it for granted. "Thomas is still asleep," she said. "Small miracles," he said. She laughed. He drank his coffee and watched the horse, and she stood beside him in the barn doorway, and the sun came up over the ridge and turned the world copper and gold, and the creek caught the light and ran brilliant in the early morning, and the land was their land, and the day was beginning. She had come to Dusthaven with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a second-hand trunk, and the kind of stillness that belongs to a woman who has survived the worst the world had to offer. She had not come looking for anything but ground to stand on. She had asked nothing of anyone, and somehow, without asking, she had been given everything. A year later, in the summer of 1887, Cora told Alfred that she was expecting again. Thomas had turned 4 in October and was, at 4, approximately the loudest person on the entire Wallace spread, a distinction he held confidently and without apology, and he was deeply interested in everything: the horses and the cattle and the creek and the kitchen and his parents' books, which he treated as objects of great fascination even though he could not yet read them, carrying them from room to room like artifacts. Alfred received the news of a second child in much the same way he had received the news of the first, with his face open and enormous, and his hands on her face, and her name said very simply, and she held his hands and smiled up at him, and the evening light came through the east window, and the ranch was peaceful around them. The child was born in February 1888, also a boy, which Thomas found satisfactory and announced to Pete Garrett with considerable authority. They named him Arthur, for Alfred's younger brother in Texas, who had never managed to come west to visit but who Alfred wrote to every month, and who wrote back in letters that arrived crumpled from the journey, but full of the warmth of a brother, who was proud and happy for the life his older brother had found. Arthur Wallace was a quieter child than Thomas, observant where Thomas was loud, careful where Thomas was impulsive, and he was from his first weeks of life inclined to study things with a patience that reminded Cora, with considerable emotion, of his father. Thomas adored him with the absolute authority of a firstborn who has decided to take his responsibilities seriously, which in practice meant a great deal of hovering and occasional rearrangement of Arthur's limbs. And Arthur, to everyone's relief, seemed to find Thomas's attention more entertaining than alarming. Agnes Pratt held Arthur at Sunday dinner when he was 3 weeks old and looked at him, and then at Cora, and then at Alfred with the expression of a woman who has arrived at the conclusion of a long and satisfying argument with the universe, and said, "Well, that is a very good outcome." Alfred looked at Cora across Agnes's parlor with the baby and the lamp and the Sunday dinner, and the particular completeness of that moment. And Cora met his gaze and thought about everything that had brought them both to this room, the losses and the distances, and the particular burned-out stubbornness of two people who had decided they could manage alone. And then the spring afternoon by the creek and the March kiss, and the books with their margin conversations, and the wood stacked by the school door on cold Thursdays. All the small accumulated evidence of two people who had found, in each other's freedom, something worth staying for. "Yes," Alfred said, looking at her, not at Agnes, and meaning more than one thing. The library grew. By 1889 it had 400 volumes and had expanded into a second room. Margaret Holt had married a surveyor named Collins and continued to teach, and she and Cora ran the school together with the easy complementary authority of two women who respected each other's methods. Thomas started school in the fall of 1888 and sat in the front row and asked questions with an enthusiasm that Margaret found charming and slightly exhausting. Thomas and Lily, Hosting's children, came back to Dusthaven in 1889 to visit. Thomas was 20 by then and studying at the school in Santa Fe, thinking about law, and he came to see Cora and sat in the library and said, with the careful formality of a young man who was still finding his voice in both his languages, "You are the reason I believed I could do this." She said, "No, you believed it. I just made sure the door was open." He said, "You made sure I was allowed in the door." She looked at him, this young man who had sat in the back of her school in 1882 and been moved to the front, who had been treated as exactly equal because he was, and she said, "Yes, and I am sorry that required effort. That is the injustice. But you are here, and you are going to be magnificent, and the world will be better for it." He sat with that for a moment, and then he nodded once, and that was enough between them. Hosteen came to the ranch in the fall of 1889 and sat with Alfred and Cora and drank coffee and spoke about the changes in the territory since 1882, which were many and not all of them good. The pressure on the Navajo people continued from the government that could not decide whether to honor its treaty obligations or abandon them, and the army post where Hosteen had worked was being reduced, and the surveyor work was ending as the land was increasingly settled and mapped. Alfred offered him work at the ranch, a real position with real wages, and Hosteen considered it with the dignity of a man who does not take offers lightly. And in the spring of 1890 he came with his family, and the Wallace spread became, in its quiet and matter-of-fact way, a place where the people who worked it were Comanche and Navajo and Mexican and Anglo, and all of them paid in the same coin and spoken to with the same respect. This was not uncontroversial in the territory of 1890. Alfred received comments about it, and Alfred received those comments with the particular evenness of a man who had thought things through and was not going to be moved, and Cora taught her students, the children of those same families, with the same conviction she had always had, that the measure of a person was the content of their mind and the honesty of their effort, and that geography and ancestry were not the arbiters of intelligence or worth. It was not a crusade. It was just how they lived. By the fall of 1890, 8 years after Cora Keller had stepped off the stagecoach in Dusthaven with her worn leather satchel and her second-hand trunk and her particular stillness, the Wallace spread was 400 acres of solid working land, 2 good horses and 40 head of cattle, a house that had grown by 2 rooms since its first iteration, a kitchen garden that bloomed in season with tomatoes and chili, and the lavender that Cora had planted along the fence because she liked the smell of it. The school in town had 40 students and a reputation that had reached the Territorial Education Board in Santa Fe, which had cited it in its 1889 report as a model of frontier education. The library had 600 books. The creek ran clear. Thomas Wallace, 7 years old, could read at a level that made his mother quietly triumphant and his father openly proud. He had his father's careful amber eyes and his mother's gray-sky stubbornness, and he was, in the estimation of everyone who knew him, going to be formidable when he grew up. Arthur Wallace, 2 years old, could say horse in 3 languages and had opinions about breakfast that he expressed at volume. Alfred and Cora sat on the porch of the ranch house on a September evening, the kind that New Mexico makes as a particular gift, warm and cool at once, the stars beginning to come out over the ridge, the boys inside with Agnes, who had come for Sunday dinner and stayed because she generally did. Cora was reading because she was always reading when she had a spare moment, and Alfred was looking at the land, his land, their land, in the way he had looked at it every evening of his adult life with the love of a man who has put himself into a place and received it back. "What are you thinking?" she asked, not looking up from her book. "I'm thinking that I was wrong," he said. She looked up. "I told Hewitt I wanted a woman who asked nothing of me," he said. "I thought that was what freedom looked like. I was wrong." "What does freedom look like?" she asked. He looked at her in the September evening with the stars coming out and the creek just audible in the distance, and he said, "This, exactly this. You, the boys, this land. Every morning you carry coffee to the barn, and every evening you read on this porch, and every time I come in from the field you are exactly yourself. No performance, no expectation, just you. And I have never in my life felt more free than I have felt with you." She put her book down on her knee and looked at him, this man she had not been looking for, this man she had not asked anything of, this man who had given her everything in the exact measure of his own free will, and she felt the 8 years of it settle around her, solid and warm and absolute, a life built, a thing completed, not finished but complete, which was different. "You know what I think," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think you were not wrong," she said. "You wanted a woman who asked nothing." "I asked nothing. And you gave me everything you had and everything you built and everything you are, and I gave you the same back. and the fact that neither of us demanded it is exactly why it is what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. "That," he said, "is the truest thing I have ever heard." Inside the house, Thomas said something in his carrying voice, and Agnes said something back in her precise carrying voice, and Arthur made a sound that suggested strong feelings about whatever was happening. And the September evening sat around them on the porch of the Wallace ranch, warm and clear and full of the smell of sage, and the sound of the creek, and the whole particular good weight of a life honestly made. Alfred reached across the arm of his chair and took her hand, and she let him, and his thumb moved once across her knuckles, and they sat in the last of the evening light with their fingers laced together, and the stars coming out one by one over the ridge, and the story of two people who had asked nothing and been given everything settled into its true shape, which was not a story that was finished, but a story that was finally fully home.